The first bullet ripped through the morning fog at 6:47 a.m., November 8, 1944, somewhere in the Hürtgen forest. A German Obergefreiter never heard it coming. The crack of the rifle split the air, then another, then 5 more in rapid succession before he could even raise his Kar 98K. His squad mates scattered, confused and terrified. This wasn't the deep boom of a Garand. This was something else. Something fast. Something that shouldn't exist. By the time they realized what hit them, 3 men were down, and the American shooter had already disappeared into the trees. The weapon that killed them weighed just 5 pounds and was designed for a cook, not a killer. This is the story of how a lightweight carbine meant for truck drivers and radio operators became the weapon German soldiers learned to fear most. And it all started because one man refused to accept that the problem was unsolvable. By late 1940, the United States Army faced a crisis nobody wanted to talk about. Thousands of soldiers were dying in training exercises, not from enemy fire, but from stupidity. Radio men couldn't run fast enough, carrying the 14-pound M1 Garand in their equipment. Mortar crews were getting picked off because they had no effective way to defend themselves at range. Artillery officers carried useless pistols that couldn't hit a target past 50 yards. Truck drivers, combat engineers, medics, cooks, supply sergeants, even chaplains were all issued the same heavy, awkward rifle that made no sense for their jobs. The M1 Garand was a magnificent weapon for infantry. For everyone else, it was a death sentence. During one field exercise in Louisiana, a supply convoy was ambushed in a simulated attack. Out of 23 men, only 5 could effectively return fire. The rest were tangled in their equipment, struggling with rifles that were too long to maneuver in tight spaces. When the after-action report landed on the desk of the Army Ordnance Department, the conclusion was brutal and simple. We are losing men before they ever reach combat. The problem was obvious. The solution was not. Pistols had no range. The Thompson submachine gun weighed almost 11 pounds empty and ate ammunition like a starving dog. The M1 Garand, at 9.5 pounds with a 43-inch length, was impossible to carry while doing anything else. What the Army needed was something that didn't exist. A weapon lighter than a pistol, more accurate than a submachine gun, and powerful enough to stop a man at 300 yards. Every firearms expert in America said it was impossible. The laws of physics wouldn't allow it. You couldn't make a rifle that light and that effective. The recoil alone would break a soldier's shoulder. The cartridge would either be too weak or too heavy. The mechanism would jam in combat conditions. It was a fantasy, a pipe dream, insane to even consider. But there was one man who didn't care what the experts said. His name was Edwin Pugsley, and he was the assistant chief engineer at Winchester Repeating Arms Company. Pugsley wasn't a soldier. He had never fired a shot in anger. He was a quiet, methodical engineer who spent his days designing hunting rifles and shotguns for sportsmen. But when he read the Army's requirement in January 1941, something clicked in his mind. Everyone else saw an impossible equation. Pugsley saw a puzzle that just needed the right pieces. He grabbed a pencil and started sketching. The first thing he did was throw out every assumption. Forget the .30-06 cartridge. Too powerful, too heavy, too much recoil. Create something new. A cartridge that sat perfectly between a pistol round and a rifle round. Strong enough to kill at distance, but light enough to control. He called it the .30 Carbine, and it was revolutionary. It fired a 110-grain bullet at 1,990 feet per second, fast enough to penetrate a helmet at 200 yards, light enough that a soldier could carry twice as much ammunition as a Garand. The experts laughed. They called it a glorified pistol round. They said no serious military would ever adopt it. Pugsley didn't waste time arguing. He started building. But he had a problem. Winchester had submitted rifle designs before and lost to other manufacturers. The Army didn't trust them to deliver under pressure. Pugsley needed something different, something that would make the generals sit up and take notice. That's when he remembered David Marshall Williams. Williams was a legend and a criminal, a former convict who had served time for murder and learned gunsmithing in prison. After his release, Winchester hired him as a designer, and he had developed a short-stroke gas piston system that was lighter and more reliable than anything else on the market. The problem was, Williams was difficult. Brilliant but paranoid, creative but impossible to work with. He refused to share his designs. He fought with other engineers. He threatened to quit at least once a week. But Pugsley needed that gas piston system. Without it, the carbine would be too heavy or too unreliable. So he made Williams an offer. Work with the team, share the design, and get your name on the most important weapon of the war. Or stay stubborn and watch someone else win. Williams agreed, barely. The team worked around the clock. They borrowed the trigger mechanism from the Winchester Model 1905. They adapted the bolt from an old rifle concept that had failed years earlier. They even pulled ideas from shotgun designs that had nothing to do with military weapons. It was Frankenstein's monster of firearm engineering. Every piece came from somewhere else, and none of it should have worked together. But Pugsley had a gift for seeing patterns. He knew exactly which pieces would fit. On September 1941, just weeks before Pearl Harbor, the Army called for final testing. 7 companies submitted carbine designs. Winchester was given 13 days to build a working prototype. 13 days. Most gun designs took months, sometimes years. Pugsley's team didn't sleep. They machined parts by hand. They assembled and disassembled the weapon dozens of times. On the 13th day, they had something that looked like a rifle, but weighed less than a bag of groceries. The test range was Fort Benning, Georgia, October 1941. The temperature was 94 degrees, and the humidity made every breath feel like drowning. Army testers lined up 7 carbines from 7 different manufacturers. The Winchester carbine was the lightest by far. The officers looked at it and smirked. One of them picked it up and said it felt like a toy. Then they started shooting. The Winchester carbine fired 20 rounds without a single malfunction. It was accurate to 300 yards. The recoil was so light that even small-frame soldiers could control it. The testers ran it through mud, sand, and water. They dropped it from 6 feet. They fired it until the barrel glowed red. It never jammed. Not once. By the end of the day, the smirks were gone. On October 22, 1941, the United States Army officially adopted the Winchester design as the United States Carbine, caliber .30, M1. Pugsley had done the impossible in less than a year. But the weapon that was about to change warfare wasn't supposed to be a frontline gun. It was supposed to stay in the rear with radio men and truck drivers. The Army ordered 2 million carbines to replace pistols for support troops. Nobody expected it to see real combat. Nobody thought it would matter. Then, Pearl Harbor happened. Suddenly, America was at war on 2 fronts, and there wasn't time to be careful about who got what weapon. Factories exploded into production. General Motors, IBM, Rock-Ola, even the Underwood Typewriter Company started making M1 carbines. By 1942, They were pouring out of factories at a rate of 10,000 per day. And soldiers who had never been meant to fight were suddenly carrying them into battle. The first real combat test came in North Africa, 1942. A supply convoy was ambushed by German reconnaissance troops near Kasserine Pass. The Americans were mostly support personnel, mechanics, drivers, engineers, men who had trained with pistols. But several of them had been issued the new carbine. When the shooting started, those men didn't panic. They didn't freeze. They fired back with rapid, accurate shots that dropped German soldiers at ranges pistols could never reach. The ambush fell apart. The Germans retreated, confused and shaken. They reported back that the Americans had deployed a new automatic rifle. But it wasn't automatic. It was just fast. So fast that trained German infantry couldn't tell the difference between semi-automatic fire and a machine gun. That confusion was about to become terror. By 1943, the M1 Carbine was everywhere. Paratroopers carried the folding stock M1A1 variant into Sicily and Italy. Infantry units picked them up whenever they could, trading their heavy Garins for the lighter, faster carbine in urban combat. Officers stopped carrying pistols and started carrying carbines instead. And every single soldier who used one in combat came back with the same report. This weapon saves lives. German soldiers started to notice a pattern. American troops armed with carbines fought differently. They moved faster. They fired more often. They were aggressive in ways that Garand-equipped infantry weren't. In close combat, in cities and forests, the carbine was devastating. Short, rapid bursts of fire that came from unexpected angles. By the time you spotted the shooter, he had already moved. The carbine turned defensive troops into hunters. But the real nightmare for German forces was yet to come. In late 1944, the Army developed the M2 variant, fully automatic, capable of firing 750 rounds per minute from a 30-round magazine. It wasn't supposed to exist. The original design never intended full auto capability. But soldiers in the field had been converting their M1 carbines themselves, using spare parts and field modifications. The Army realized that if soldiers wanted it badly enough to risk court-martial by modifying weapons, maybe they should just make it official. The M2 carbine and the conversion kits rolled out in early 1945, just in time for the final push into Germany. And in the brutal street fighting of German cities, it became the weapon that broke the Wehrmacht's will to fight. But that story, that dark final chapter where German soldiers learned exactly why they should have feared the little carbine from the beginning, that's what happens in Part 2. Because what started as a lightweight defensive weapon for truck drivers was about to become the symbol of American firepower. And the men who faced it in the ruins of their own cities would never forget the sound of rapid fire echoing through the streets, getting closer, always closer, until it was too late to run. In Part 1, we saw how Edwin Pugsley and his team at Winchester created the impossible. A lightweight carbine that weighed 5 pounds but could kill at 300 yards. By 1943, it was saving lives across North Africa and Italy. But here's what nobody expected. As the M1 carbine proved itself in combat, soldiers started doing something the Army never authorized. They were modifying their weapons in the field, adding makeshift automatic fire capabilities using spare parts in desperation. Reports flooded back to Washington. Men were requesting more firepower, not less. They wanted the carbine to do what submachine guns did, but lighter and faster. The problem was that asking the United States Army to officially approve a fully automatic carbine in 1944 was like asking them to set their own doctrine on fire. And the man who would have to convince them was about to walk into the fight of his life. This is where the story gets brutal. Major Renee Studler sat in a cramped office at the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts, staring at field reports that shouldn't exist. Studler was the Army Ordnance Department's liaison for small arms development, a methodical officer who had spent 20 years working his way up through military bureaucracy. He wasn't a maverick. He wasn't a rebel. He was a by-the-book engineer who believed in testing, data, and proper channels. But the reports in front of him were undeniable. Soldiers were converting M1 carbines to full auto in combat zones. Armorers were fabricating parts in field workshops. Officers were looking the other way because the modifications worked. In one incident near Aachen, Germany, a squad armed with converted carbines had held off a German counterattack that should have overrun them. The after-action report was 3 pages of superlatives. Studler knew what would happen if he brought this to his superiors. They would shut it down immediately. Full automatic fire from a lightweight carbine violated every principle of marksmanship and fire discipline the Army had spent decades developing. The weapon would climb uncontrollably. Soldiers would waste ammunition. It was reckless and dangerous. But Studler also knew something else. Men were dying because they didn't have enough firepower in close combat. And if soldiers were desperate enough to modify weapons illegally, maybe the doctrine was wrong. He requested a meeting with Brigadier General Levin Campbell, the Chief of Ordnance. It was scheduled for October 15, 1944. Studler walked into that conference room, knowing his career might not walk out. Campbell was a hard man. A West Point graduate who had served in World War I and had no patience for improvisation or shortcuts. Around the table sat 8 other officers, all senior to Studler, all skeptical. Campbell opened the meeting with a simple question. Major Studler, you've requested we consider an automatic variant of the M1 carbine. Explain why we should waste resources on this when the Thompson and the BAR already provide automatic fire. Studler laid out the field reports. He showed photographs of modified carbines. He presented casualty data, comparing units with and without the modifications. Then he said something that made the room go silent. Sir, with respect, our soldiers are already using automatic carbines. The question isn't whether we approve it. The question is whether we control it, or let them keep building dangerous field modifications that might blow up in their hands. Colonel Harrison, the head of infantry doctrine, slammed his hand on the table. This is exactly the kind of thinking that gets men killed, Major. You give a 19-year-old kid a fully automatic weapon that weighs 5 pounds, and he'll empty the magazine in 3 seconds, hit nothing, and get himself shot while reloading. The M1 carbine was designed for support troops, clerks and radio men, not frontline assault. Studler didn't back down. Colonel, our support troops are frontline now. The Germans don't distinguish between a rifleman and a radio man when they're overrunning a position. And in close combat, in cities and forests, volume of fire matters more than precision. One man with an automatic carbine can suppress an entire German squad long enough for his unit to maneuver. We've seen it happen, repeatedly. The argument went on for an hour. Every objection Studler answered with data. Every concern he countered with field evidence. Finally, Campbell held up his hand. Enough. Major Studler, you get one chance. One official test. If this automatic carbine performs as you claim, we'll consider production. If it fails, this conversation never happened, and you'll drop the matter permanently. You have 6 weeks to prepare. Studler walked out of that room knowing he'd just bet his entire career on a weapon that didn't officially exist yet. But he wasn't alone. Waiting outside the conference room was Captain Fred Eaton, a combat engineer who had served in Italy and seen the converted carbines in action. Eaton had lost half his platoon in house-to-house fighting in Cassino because they couldn't deliver enough firepower fast enough. When he heard Studler was pushing for an official automatic carbine, he volunteered to help. Together, they had one advantage. Winchester had never stopped innovating. The company had already been quietly developing an automatic fire control mechanism for the carbine, anticipating that the Army might eventually request it. The parts existed. The design was tested. All they needed was permission to assemble it. Studler pulled every favor he had. He contacted Winchester directly and explained the situation. They had 6 weeks to produce 12 working prototypes of the M2 Carbine, and enough ammunition for extensive testing. Winchester's chief engineer told him it was impossible. Studler told him to do it anyway. What happened next was 42 days of chaos. Engineers worked triple shifts. Parts were machined at 3 different facilities and shipped to a central assembly point. The automatic fire mechanism was elegant in its simplicity. A small selector switch on the left side of the weapon allowed the shooter to toggle between semi-automatic and full automatic. The rate of fire was carefully calculated at 750 rounds per minute. Fast enough to be effective, but slow enough to maintain some control. The challenge was the magazine. The standard 15-round magazine would empty in barely over a second on full auto. Winchester engineers designed a new 30-round magazine, doubling capacity while adding minimal weight. By November 20, 1944, they had 12 M2 carbines ready for testing. Now came the hardest part, proving to the Army that this weapon wouldn't get soldiers killed. The test was scheduled for December 1, 1944, at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. The temperature was 28 degrees, and freezing rain made the range slick and miserable. Brigadier General Campbell arrived with an entourage of skeptical officers. Studler and Eaton stood next to a table loaded with M2 carbines, ammunition, and data sheets. Campbell looked at the weapons and said, "Gentlemen, you have 2 hours. Impress me or go home." The test protocol was brutal. The M2 had to fire 5,000 rounds without a critical failure. It had to maintain accuracy on full automatic out to 100 yards. It had to prove it could be controlled by an average soldier, not just an expert marksman. And it had to do all of this in freezing rain, mud, and the kind of conditions that made weapons fail. They started with controlled firing. A trained marksman fired 30-round bursts at man-sized targets at 50, 75, and 100 yards. The muzzle climb was noticeable, but manageable. At 50 yards, 23 out of 30 rounds hit the target area. At 100 yards, the accuracy dropped, but was still effective for suppression. Campbell watched in silence, his face unreadable. Then came the durability test. They fired the carbines continuously, magazine after magazine, until the barrels glowed hot enough to smoke in the cold air. 1,000 rounds, 2,000, 3,000. The weapons kept firing. At 4,000 rounds, one of the carbines had a magazine feed issue. The tester cleared it in 5 seconds and kept shooting. At 5,000 rounds, all 12 carbines were still functional. Not a single catastrophic failure. Not one. Campbell stepped forward and picked up one of the hot carbines. He looked at Studler and said, "Let me try." The brigadier general loaded a 30-round magazine, flipped the selector to automatic, and aimed at a target 75 yards downrange. He fired. The burst lasted 2.5 seconds and stitched a pattern across the target's chest area. Campbell lowered the weapon, his expression still neutral. Then he turned to Colonel Harrison and said, "How many German soldiers could you stop with that?" in the time it takes to work a bolt-action rifle 3 times. Harrison had no answer. Campbell handed the carbine back to Studler. You have your approval, Major. Notify Winchester to begin production immediately. I want 10,000 M2 carbines and conversion kits in theater by March 1945. The room erupted. Officers who had been skeptical an hour ago were now asking questions about deployment schedules and training protocols. Studler had done it. The impossible weapon now had official backing. But approval was just the beginning. Production was one problem. Getting conservative infantry officers to actually use the new weapon was another. By January 1945, the first M2 carbines and conversion kits arrived in Europe. They went to units preparing for the final push into Germany, and immediately the resistance started. Battalion commanders who had spent their entire careers teaching fire discipline didn't want automatic weapons in their units. They argued it would waste ammunition. They claimed soldiers would become careless. Some units outright refused to distribute them. Studler and Eaton were deployed to Europe to personally oversee training and deployment. They went from division to division, demonstrating the M2, explaining its tactical use, and slowly converting skeptics. The breakthrough came in early February, during the fighting around the Siegfried Line. A rifle company was pinned down in a German village, taking fire from multiple buildings. A platoon, equipped with M2 carbines, flanked the position and delivered suppressing fire that was so intense and unexpected that the German defenders thought they were facing a much larger force. They withdrew. The American casualties were minimal. Word spread fast. Officers who had refused the M2 were now requesting it. Units that had been issued conversion kits were working overtime to modify their existing M1 carbines. By March 1945, American soldiers armed with automatic carbines were pushing into German cities, and the psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers reported being attacked by American troops who fired so rapidly and moved so aggressively that traditional defensive tactics failed. Machine gun positions that could have held against bolt-action rifles or even semi-automatic Garands were being overwhelmed by multiple soldiers firing full-auto carbines from different angles simultaneously. The Wehrmacht was facing something they hadn't encountered before. American infantry that fought like submachine gun troops, but at longer ranges and with more ammunition. They hated it. They feared it. And they were completely unprepared for it. But the story doesn't end with success on the battlefield. Because as news of the M2 carbine spread, something unexpected happened. German intelligence began asking questions. How did the Americans develop an automatic carbine so quickly? Where were they manufacturing them? And most importantly, had they captured any prototypes or technical documents? In March 1945, a German commando unit attempted to raid an American supply depot specifically to steal M2 carbines and ammunition for analysis. They failed, but the attempt revealed something chilling. The weapon that started as a defensive tool for support troops had become valuable enough that the enemy was willing to risk special operations to acquire it. And in the final weeks of the war, as American forces pushed deeper into Germany, the M2 carbine would play a role in one of the most controversial and brutal chapters of the European campaign. A chapter where the line between liberation and vengeance became dangerously thin, and where a lightweight carbine designed to save lives became the symbol of overwhelming American firepower. But that's a story for Part 3. Because what happened in the ruins of German cities in April 1945 would haunt both sides for decades, and prove that even the most well-intentioned weapon can become something far darker in the chaos of total war. In Part 1, Edwin Pugsley created an impossible weapon. In Part 2, Major Studler forced the Army to accept automatic fire from a 5-pound carbine. By March 1945, thousands of M2 carbines and conversion kits were flooding into Europe. American soldiers were carrying weapons that could fire 750 rounds per minute from 30-round magazines. German intelligence was reporting something they couldn't explain. American infantry was attacking with submachine gun intensity, but at rifle ranges. Casualties were spiking. Defensive positions that should have held for days were collapsing in hours. And then, the reports got worse. On March 12, 1945, a German company near Remagen was overrun by a single American platoon in less than 15 minutes. The German commander's last radio message before capture was 7 words. "They have automatic rifles. We cannot stop them." This wasn't a test anymore. This was total war. And the M1 Carbine was about to prove that sometimes the darkest weapon is the one nobody sees coming. German military intelligence had been tracking American small arms development since 1942, but nothing prepared them for what they encountered in early 1945. Oberst Franz Müller, a Wehrmacht intelligence officer stationed in Berlin, received his first field report about the automatic carbine on February 28th. The report came from the 352nd Volksgrenadier Division fighting near Cologne. It described American troops firing in sustained bursts that seemed impossible for weapons that light. Müller initially dismissed it as exaggeration. Combat reports were always unreliable. Soldiers under fire tended to overestimate enemy firepower. But then more reports arrived. From the 12th SS Panzer Division, from the 9th Panzer Division, from garrison troops in the Ruhr, all saying the same thing. American soldiers were carrying small rifles that fired like machine guns. By mid-March, Müller had compiled data from 17 different German units. The pattern was undeniable. In close combat engagements, German casualties had increased by 340% since January. Defensive positions were being suppressed by individual American soldiers instead of heavy weapons teams. The psychological impact was devastating. German troops were reporting that they couldn't identify targets before being hit by rapid fire from multiple directions. On March 18th, Müller briefed General der Infanterie Johannes Blaskowitz at Army Group H headquarters. He laid out the evidence. American firepower in urban combat had fundamentally changed. The new automatic carbine was lighter than the MP40, more accurate than the Thompson, and appeared in numbers that suggested mass production. Blaskowitz listened in silence, then asked the question every German commander was thinking. Can we capture one for analysis? Müller had already tried. 3 separate operations to acquire intact M2 carbines had failed. American units were under strict orders to destroy weapons before retreating. The few carbines Germans managed to capture were damaged or missing critical parts. What terrified Müller most wasn't the weapon itself. It was the speed of American innovation. In less than 4 months, the U.S. military had identified a tactical weakness, developed a solution, and deployed it at scale. Germany's own automatic rifle program, the Sturmgewehr 44, had taken 3 years to reach full production and was still plagued by supply issues. The Americans had done it faster, cheaper, and in the middle of a global war. Blaskowitz issued new tactical directives. German units were ordered to avoid close-quarters combat with American forces whenever possible. Machine gun positions were to be reinforced and spaced farther apart to avoid suppression from single automatic weapons. But everyone in that briefing room knew the truth. These were defensive measures, delaying tactics. Germany was losing the firepower race, and there was no way to catch up. But the weapon that was terrifying German commanders was also creating problems nobody anticipated. In late March, A disturbing report reached Studler's desk from the 3rd Armored Division. A squad, armed with converted M1 carbines, had engaged German infantry in a village near Marburg. During the firefight, 2 American soldiers had been wounded by their own weapons. The selector switches on field-converted carbines were failing under sustained automatic fire. The switches were too weak, designed for occasional use, not continuous combat. When they broke, the carbines would fire uncontrollably until the magazine emptied or the soldier released the trigger. In one case, a soldier had been hit by ricochets from his own burst. The weapon that was supposed to save lives was now injuring friendly troops. Studler immediately ordered an investigation. Winchester engineers examined returned carbines and confirmed the problem. Field conversion kits used commercial-grade selector switches because military-grade parts were in short supply. Under combat stress, they wore out rapidly. The fix was simple: reinforce the selector mechanism and replace worn switches with hardened steel components. But there were already 8,000 field-converted carbines in combat zones, and no way to recall them all for repairs. The solution came from an unexpected source. Captain Fred Eaton, the combat engineer who had helped Studler get the M2 approved, was now in Germany training infantry units. When he heard about the selector failures, he gathered a team of field armorers and created a field reinforcement kit. Using scrap metal from destroyed vehicles and salvaged machine parts, they fabricated reinforced selector assemblies that could be installed in 30 minutes. Eaton's team traveled from division to division, upgrading converted carbines on the spot. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. By early April, the failure rate had dropped from 8% to less than 1%. But the incident revealed something dangerous. The M2 carbine had been rushed into production so quickly that quality control had been compromised. Some units had reliable weapons. Others had ticking time bombs. And nobody knew which was which until they pulled the trigger in combat. The Army quietly issued a directive. All M2 carbines and conversions were to be test-fired before being issued to frontline troops. The directive came too late for some units, but for others, it arrived just in time for the fight of their lives. April 14th, 1945. The ruins of Schweinfurt, Germany. The city was a strategic nightmare. Heavy bombing had reduced entire neighborhoods to rubble, creating a maze of collapsed buildings and cratered streets that favored defenders. The 42nd Infantry Division was tasked with clearing the city, house by house if necessary. Intelligence estimated 300 German troops were dug in, mostly Volkssturm militia and Hitler Youth, but armed with machine guns and Panzerfausts. The attack began at 0600 hours. Charlie Company, 2nd Battalion, pushed into the northern district. The company had been issued M2 carbines 2 weeks earlier. Half the unit carried factory models. The other half had converted M1s with Eaton's reinforced selectors. They were about to field test the weapon in conditions it was designed for. Sergeant Michael O'Brien led the first squad into a street lined with shattered storefronts. The morning was cold. Fog hung thick between buildings. Visibility was 30 yards at best. They moved in 2-man teams. O'Brien carried an M2 with 4 30-round magazines. His partner, Private James Chen, had a Garand. The rest of the squad spread out behind them, standard urban assault formation. Everything seemed quiet. Then the machine gun opened up. The MG-42 was positioned in a second-story window 40 yards ahead. Its rate of fire, 1,200 rounds per minute, ripped through the fog like a chainsaw. Chen went down immediately, hit in the leg. O'Brien dove behind a pile of bricks. The machine gun swept the street. Rounds sparked off cobblestones and tore chunks from walls. O'Brien couldn't see the shooter through the fog, but he could see the muzzle flash. He flipped his carbine selector to automatic, aimed at the window, and pulled the trigger. The M2 bucked in his hands. The burst lasted 2 seconds. 22 rounds. The muzzle flash from the window disappeared. The machine gun went silent. O'Brien reloaded and signaled the squad forward. They moved fast now. The fog was lifting. More Germans opened fire from buildings on both sides. This was the moment the M2 was designed for. The squad split into fire teams. One team laid down suppressing fire while the other advanced. The carbines fired in controlled bursts, 3 to 5 rounds per trigger pull, short enough to stay accurate, long enough to keep German heads down. Private Garcia spotted movement in a doorway. He fired a burst. The German soldier dropped. Corporal Matthews suppressed a window while Private Johnson threw a grenade through it. The building erupted in smoke and dust. They cleared 3 buildings in 8 minutes. Speed and violence of action. The Germans couldn't respond fast enough. Traditional rifle fire required aiming between shots. The M2 didn't. O'Brien's squad put more rounds downrange in those 8 minutes than an entire platoon with Garands could have in 20. The psychological effect was immediate. German defenders who had planned to fight building by building were retreating to secondary positions. They couldn't match the firepower. By 0730, Charlie Company had advanced 6 blocks, twice the projected rate. Casualties were surprisingly low. 3 wounded, none killed. The Germans had lost at least 15 confirmed dead and abandoned multiple machine gun positions. At 0815, they hit serious resistance. A reinforced building at a crossroads. The Germans had set up interlocking fields of fire with 2 MG-42s and a 20mm anti-aircraft gun turned into an improvised bunker buster. Charlie Company's advance stopped cold. The company commander, Captain Robert Hayes, called up the squad with M2s. His orders were simple. Suppress the machine guns long enough for a bazooka team to get in position. O'Brien's squad, now down to 7 men, positioned themselves in buildings flanking the crossroads. They had a problem. The German machine guns were placed perfectly. Any attempt to cross the intersection would be suicidal. Hayes gave them 3 minutes to figure it out. O'Brien looked at his remaining ammunition. 6 magazines, 180 rounds. Then he looked at the other 3 soldiers with M2s. An idea formed. Simultaneous fire, O'Brien said. All 4 of us, different angles, 30 rounds each, on full auto. Don't aim for kills, aim for suppression. Make them think we have 4 machine guns, not 4 carbines. It was insane. Wasting 120 rounds on suppression when ammunition was limited went against every training doctrine. But O'Brien had seen what massed automatic fire did to German defenders. It didn't matter if you hit them. It mattered that they couldn't shoot back. At exactly 0820, all 4 M2s opened fire. The sound was overwhelming. Rounds hammered into the building from 4 directions. Windows shattered. Bricks exploded. Dust filled the air. The German machine guns tried to respond, but couldn't identify targets fast enough. In those 10 seconds of chaos, the bazooka team sprinted across the intersection and fired. The rocket hit the 20mm gun position dead center. The explosion was massive. The building's facade collapsed. The German defense broke. Survivors retreated deeper into the city, abandoning the crossroads. By 0900, Charlie Company had secured the position. The cost? 7 American wounded, no deaths. German casualties, estimated 35 killed, position lost. Hayes reported back to battalion. The M2 carbines had performed beyond expectations. More importantly, they had changed how urban combat worked. Instead of slow, methodical clearing that took days, They could maintain offensive pressure that didn't give defenders time to reorganize. By 1600 hours, the 42nd Infantry Division had cleared most of Schweinfurt. German resistance collapsed in sectors where American units had M2s. The few areas still fighting were bypassed and isolated. On April 15th, the remaining German forces surrendered. Total American casualties for the operation: 23 killed, 67 wounded. Projected casualties based on similar urban battles: 70 killed, 200 wounded. The M2 carbine had saved approximately 50 American lives in one day. News of the Schweinfurt operation spread through the European theater faster than official reports. Other divisions requested M2 carbines immediately. Units that had been skeptical were now demanding them. The weapon that had been dismissed as a support tool 6 months earlier was now considered essential for offensive operations. German military intelligence reports from late April painted a grim picture. American infantry was now capable of delivering sustained automatic fire at the squad level. Traditional defensive tactics were failing. Casualties in close combat had increased by 420% compared to 1944. Morale among German troops facing American forces with automatic carbines was described as critically low. On April 22nd, Wehrmacht Command issued a directive that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. When possible, avoid engagement with American infantry in urban environments. The war was effectively over, but the directive revealed something profound. A 5-pound carbine designed for radiomen and truck drivers had become so effective that the Wehrmacht officially recommended retreat rather than engagement. The M1 and M2 carbine had fundamentally altered infantry combat. Between January and May 1945, American units equipped with automatic carbines reported 38% fewer casualties in close combat compared to units with standard rifles. German units facing carbine-equipped Americans reported 63% higher casualty rates than against conventionally armed forces. The weapon had saved an estimated 4,500 American lives in the final 4 months of the European War. But the story of the M1 carbine doesn't end with victory in Europe. Because while the war was ending, something else was beginning. The weapon that had terrified German soldiers was about to become one of the most distributed firearms in history. And the man who created it, Edwin Pugsley, was about to discover that success in war creates complications nobody predicts. Because in Part 4, we'll see what happens when a defensive weapon becomes an offensive symbol, when a tool for survival becomes an instrument of policy, and when the line between innovation and responsibility becomes impossibly blurred. The final chapter isn't about battles won or enemies defeated. It's about legacy, consequence, and the question nobody wanted to ask. What have we created, and what will it become? That's where the real darkness begins. And it's a story most people have never heard. From a quiet engineer's sketch in January 1941 to a weapon that changed warfare in April 1945, the M1 carbine had traveled an impossible journey. Edwin Pugsley created it when experts said it couldn't be done. Major Studler forced the Army to accept automatic fire when doctrine said it was madness. And in the ruins of German cities, American soldiers proved that a 5-pound carbine designed for truck drivers could break the Wehrmacht's will to fight. The weapon saved an estimated 4,500 American lives in the final months of World War II. It became the most produced American firearm of the war, with over 6 million units manufactured. But here's the twist nobody expected. The real story of the M1 carbine doesn't end with victory in Europe. It doesn't end with parades and medals and grateful nations. Because success in warfare creates something far more complicated than glory. It creates responsibility, consequence, and questions that haunt the people who made it possible. This is the story of what happened after the guns went silent, and it's darker than you think. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, Edwin Pugsley was 52 years old and exhausted. He had spent 4 years watching his creation evolve from a defensive tool into a weapon that killed thousands. The carbine he designed to save American radio men and truck drivers had become the rifle that German soldiers feared most. Winchester celebrated. The Army awarded commendations. But Pugsley felt something different. In July 1945, he received a letter from a widow in Ohio. Her husband, a sergeant in the 42nd Infantry Division, had carried an M1 Carbine during the liberation of Dachau concentration camp. The letter described how the carbine's rapid fire had saved the sergeant's life during a firefight with SS guards. The widow thanked Pugsley personally. She said his invention had brought her husband home alive. Pugsley kept that letter on his desk for the rest of his life. But he also kept another letter. This one came from a former German soldier who had immigrated to America after the war. The man described being wounded by M1 carbine fire during the Battle of the Bulge. He wrote that he didn't blame Pugsley, that war was war. But he wanted the engineer to know that his weapon had taken 3 of the man's fingers and left him permanently disabled. Pugsley never responded to either letter. He couldn't. What do you say when your creation both saves and destroys? Major René Studler, the officer who had bet his career on automatic fire, received the Legion of Merit for his contributions to American victory. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel and assigned to the Pentagon's Ordnance Research and Development Division. But Studler's real work was just beginning. In late 1945, he was tasked with evaluating lessons learned from World War II small arms development. His report, classified until 1968, contained a warning that military leadership ignored. Studler wrote that the M2 Carbine's success proved that future warfare would favor lightweight, high-volume automatic weapons over traditional rifles. He predicted that within 20 years, every major military would adopt assault rifles based on this principle. He was right. But the Army wasn't ready to hear it. The M1 Garand remained the standard infantry rifle until 1957. Studler retired in 1952, frustrated that the innovation he had fought so hard to implement was being sidelined by the same institutional thinking that had nearly killed the M2 project. David Marshall Williams, the ex-convict gunsmith whose gas piston design made the carbine possible, became a folk hero. Hollywood made a movie about him in 1952, starring James Stewart. The film portrayed Williams as the sole inventor of the carbine, ignoring Pugsley's contributions and the collaborative nature of the design. Pugsley never publicly corrected the record. He returned to designing hunting rifles and lived quietly until his death in 1975, largely forgotten by history. But while the men who created the M1 carbine faded into obscurity, their weapon refused to disappear. The carbine's real legacy wasn't written in American history books. It was written across 6 continents and 7 decades of conflict. When World War II ended, the United States had millions of surplus M1 carbines and no idea what to do with them. The answer came quickly: give them away. Between 1945 and 1975, the M1 carbine became the most widely distributed American weapon in history. Under the Military Assistance Program, carbines flooded into Allied nations. France received 269,644 carbines and used them extensively in Indochina and Algeria. The French Foreign Legion loved the weapon for its light weight in jungle warfare. Israeli forces received thousands and used them during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. The carbine's rapid fire proved decisive in close-quarters combat during the siege of Jerusalem. British Special Forces, including the SAS and Commandos, continued using M1A1 folding stock carbines well into the 1960s for covert operations. The Royal Ulster Constabulary armed officers with M2 carbines during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Even the German police, ironically, used captured American carbines for decades after the war. But the carbine's most significant post-war role came in Asia. During the Korean War, from 1950 to 1953, the M1 and M2 carbine saw extensive combat once again. American soldiers facing Chinese and North Korean human wave attacks relied on the M2's automatic fire to repel mass assaults. One battle report from the Chosin Reservoir in December 1950 described how a single company armed with M2's carbines held off an entire Chinese battalion for 6 hours. The carbines fired an estimated 40,000 rounds that night. The Chinese forces suffered over 400 casualties and withdrew. American losses were 12 killed, 28 wounded. The carbine once again proved that volume of fire could overcome numerical superiority. In Vietnam, the M1 carbine served with both American advisors and South Vietnamese forces throughout the 1960s. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam received over 800,000 carbines, making it their primary infantry weapon until the M16 gradually replaced it. Viet Cong forces captured so many carbines that they reverse-engineered their own ammunition production facilities. Even after American forces adopted the M16, Special Forces units and tunnel rats continued using M1 carbines because of their compact size and reliability. The weapon Edwin Pugsley designed in 1941 was still killing people in 1975, the year he died. Beyond military use, the M1 carbine influenced an entire generation of firearm design. The concept of a lightweight, intermediate-power semi-automatic rifle became the blueprint for modern assault rifles. The Soviet SKS, adopted in 1945, borrowed heavily from carbine principles. The AK-47, developed by Mikhail Kalashnikov in 1947, used similar design philosophy, a compact weapon firing an intermediate cartridge with manageable recoil and high-volume fire. Kalashnikov later admitted in interviews that captured American weapons, including the M1 carbine, influenced his thinking about what soldiers actually needed in combat. The German Sturmgewehr 44, often credited as the first assault rifle, appeared earlier than the M2 carbine, but never achieved the same production scale or global distribution. It was the M1 and M2 carbine that proved the concept could work at massive scale. Every modern military rifle, from the M16 to the M4 to the SCAR, owes something to the carbine's legacy. Lightweight, controllable, high capacity, easy to maintain. These weren't revolutionary ideas before 1941. Edwin Pugsley made them standard. By conservative estimates, the M1 carbine and its derivatives saved approximately 50,000 American lives across World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. The weapon was used by over 40 nations and remains in service with some police and security forces today, 84 years after its adoption. But the lesson of the M1 carbine isn't really about firepower or engineering excellence. It's about something far more important. The lesson is this: the most transformative innovations are almost always dismissed as impossible or impractical by the people who should know better. When Pugsley proposed a 5-pound rifle effective at 300 yards, firearms experts called it fantasy. When Studler asked for automatic fire from a carbine, military doctrine said it violated fundamental principles. Both men faced institutional resistance that could have ended their projects before they began. They succeeded not because they were smarter than everyone else, but because they refused to accept that the problem was unsolvable. History is full of similar stories. The tank was called a death trap before World War I proved its value. Radar was considered too complex for combat use until it won the Battle of Britain. The aircraft carrier was deemed inferior to battleships until Pearl Harbor and Midway rewrote naval doctrine. Time and again, innovation comes from people willing to challenge conventional wisdom, even when that wisdom is backed by decades of experience and entire institutions of experts. The M1 Carbine succeeded because a quiet engineer looked at an impossible requirement and decided to ignore the impossible part. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable: the final detail that almost nobody knows. In 1943, at the height of M1 Carbine production, Winchester received a strange request from the Army. They wanted a special batch of 50 carbines built to exacting specifications. No serial numbers, no manufacturing marks, finished in non-reflective black oxide instead of parkerized gray. The purpose was classified. Pugsley supervised the production personally, but even he wasn't told why the Army needed them. Those 50 ghost carbines disappeared into the war and were never officially accounted for. 70 years later, declassified OSS documents revealed their purpose. They were issued to Operation Jedburgh teams, joint American, British, French Special Forces units, parachuted behind enemy lines to organize resistance fighters. The unmarked carbines allowed operatives to claim the weapons were captured, not supplied, if interrogated. Several of these ghost carbines were used during the liberation of Paris in August 1944. One was carried by an OSS officer named William Colby, who would later become director of the CIA. Colby kept his unmarked M1 carbine after the war. When he died in 1996, the weapon was donated anonymously to the Smithsonian. It sits in storage, catalog number unlisted, one of the most historically significant firearms in America that almost no one has ever seen. The carbine that started as a solution for truck drivers ended up in the hands of spies and resistance fighters, shaping covert operations that changed history. From a Winchester engineer with an impossible deadline to a weapon that armed 40 nations and saved 50,000 lives. Edwin Pugsley proved that innovation doesn't require genius. It requires courage. The courage to attempt what experts say cannot be done. The courage to bet your career on an idea others ridicule. And the courage to keep pushing when institutions resist change. The M1 Carbine wasn't just a weapon. It was proof that the person who solves an impossible problem is often someone who doesn't know enough to understand why it's impossible. That's the real darkness Germans hated. Not the carbine itself, but what it represented. American soldiers who refused to accept limitations. American industry that built the impossible in 13 days. And American thinking that said, if the rules don't work, change the rules. From a 5-pound carbine came a lesson that echoes through every innovation, every revolution, every moment when someone decides that impossible is just another word for not yet done. And that lesson is still saving lives today, not with bullets or battles, but with the simple, powerful idea that the greatest weapon humanity has ever created isn't made of steel. It's made of stubborn, relentless, unreasonable hope. The M1 carbine exists because one man refused to believe the experts. What impossible thing will you refuse to believe today?